Hey everyone, welcome back. We've been taking a look at the origins of contemporary topics within the humanities. Last time we were taking a look at Dadaism and how it begins this discussion of what is art and what is an artist, and does a work of art have to be merely representational in order to be considered great, or can the greatness of art be in the discussion that it creates on what art is? And again, a big part of what Dadaism is seeking to do is seeking to be funny about the world around us, and to be somewhat humorous in its discussion about things that we generally take seriously, and suggesting that maybe art is seen as too kind of quasi-religious, and museums are these kind of quasi-religious institutions where people go for enlightenment and to be uplifted. And I think Dadaism is perhaps suggesting that art can just be art, right? It can just be an artifact that is a way of expressing an idea or an emotion, and that can be enough. I like this image here by a surrealist, René Magritte, and it's entitled, "This is not a pipe," right? So it says in French, "This is not a pipe." It's a painting of a pipe. But then you have the words below it that contradict or contrast the actual image. And so what we see with this contemporary discussion about what art is maybe things aren't as they seem. Maybe art can be more, or maybe it can defy our expectations. Maybe the assumptions that we have about the world around us can be wrong, and to try to rid ourselves of these false assumptions. And maybe that's what art is a means to be able to question the world around us. I want to take a look at the second major movement that forces this new discussion, a new direction for art, and that is surrealism. A lot of the surrealists, or a lot of the Dadaists, became surrealist. They kind of were critiquing rational order so much that there was nowhere else for them to critique except the inner mind, and so they start turning to the inner mind. So let's take a look at what surrealism is, and these definitions are my definitions, and so they're perhaps limited in that scope, but it's just to give you a flavor or a sense of what the movement is all about. Surrealism was an art movement that began during the 1920s and was an outgrowth of Dadaism's critique on rational order, suggesting that we can't necessarily make sense of the world around us, because that's what we generally tend to do, right? We tend to take two events and we say, oh, there must be some significance or meaning to them. They must be somehow linked together. And Dadaism is suggesting, well, what if there is no link, right? So it's critiquing that rational order, and surrealism gets its origins from that. Surrealism was strongly influenced by Freud's structural model, believing that underneath human subconscious lie very strong sexual and violent desires that humans must repress. We would call that, using the language we use in the church, we would call that the natural man. But what Freud argues is that we have these base desires to reproduce and to protect our resources. And so these generally tend to be very violent and sexual motivations, desires that humanity has. That's just a natural part of who we are, but we can't just, unleash these. We need to find positive outlets for them. Otherwise, society would be in chaos. Surrealists believe that the best way to understand humankind is through understanding our subconscious, and so suggesting that if you really want to understand what motivates us, and that's really what Freud and the Surrealists are seeking, is what's the true essence of humanity, what motivates us. The best way to do that is to remove the rational mask that we put on, right? When we go out into the world, we generally tend to put on this kind of proverbial mask that we present ourselves to the world. And what they're suggesting is, let's peel that mask back a little bit and look at what's underneath the surface, because that's true, right? That's the true essence of human nature. So that's what they're looking for. But what they're looking for is truth, right? What is the truth? Dadaism is looking for truth, and what is the truth of random events that have no greater meanings or significance? And surrealism is, what is the truth that's underneath the surface of humanity? Hence, much of their works are dominated by dreamlike sequences with themes of sexuality, violence, fear of death, and the uncanny. And we'll we'll skip past a lot of the sexual images that come out of surrealism just for a VidAngel edit. But we'll take a look at some of the violence and the fears that we see within them. So you'll still get a sense of what surrealism is all about. But I want to take a look at that last point here, the uncanny. A lot of people are unfamiliar with that. It's actually a Freudian term. He suggests that the uncanny is things that are familiar to us and foreign at the same time, things that look somewhat similar but look kind of different. A term that's used in the world today is the uncanny valley. This is where you see this is a Japanese robot that they created to try to make it seem as though, and this is kind of an AI thing where you can interact with her and she can respond back to you based on your responses, based on your emotional expressions. She's supposed to be able to respond, but it looks creepy, right? Because it looks familiar, it looks kind of like a face, but not quite, right? It's still a little bit off. And the same thing that we see in Polar Express, right? A lot of people, when that came out, rejected it because it was too close to humanity, right? If you're going to have a cartoon, it's nice to have, a cartoon with people that look somewhat similar, like Moana or something like that. But this one, what they were messing around with is, well, let's try to get these computer graphics to look more human. And as they did that, it became a little bit more creepy, right? So things that are familiar and foreign to us. Or you see, I don't know if you've seen, what was this one called? The Boy, I think, which was, I don't know, a thriller that came out, a horror film that came out a couple years ago. And then you have this mannequin here, this creepy doll, and it looks somewhat like a human being, but not quite. And so it creates that uncomfortable kind of look. And we're going to see, not necessarily that it's going to be creepy or uncomfortable with surrealism, but they're going to take a look at things that look familiar to us and foreign at the same time. Because what Freud argues is that uncanny valley produces these elements of fear and violence within us. Taking a look at Freud and his ideas, this is perhaps reviewed to some of you, but his structural model that he came out with in the 1920s, which is heavily influencing surrealism, suggests that we have individual needs and we have social needs. At any time we make a decision, we have to balance between these. As my wife and I decide what movie to watch, right, I have my own individual needs. I like action films, I like dramas, I like things that have deep social meaning to them, and she likes comedy. She likes things that are nice and fluffy and not necessarily having to dig deeper because it's kind of an escape, right? She just kind of wants to relax at the end of the day, and I'm still wanting to have this deeper insights and deeper introspection into the human condition, and she's not necessarily into that all the time. So we have this battle, right? So I have my individual needs of what I want to watch. She has her individual needs, and then there's the larger social needs within our marriage that we have to then find some type of compromise, right? And we see this again and again, right? As we're late to an appointment, we have our individual needs to get to our destination as fast as we can, but we also have the social needs of traffic laws, stoplights and speed limits and things like that we have to balance between. And so Freud argues that any decision that we make has to balance between what society wants of us and our own individual needs. And the individual needs he calls the superego, right? The idea that these are our conscious forces, whether that's religion, whether it's legal, political entities, or whether it's social entities such as a family or a community. We have these exterior needs that are demanding things from us, certain laws, behaviors, commandments, right? And then there's our own individual needs, which Freud argues is actually below the surface. And so the subconscious self that we're not necessarily always aware of that are driving us. And here he says this is where all of the dark, violent, sexual tendencies come from. And then what he suggests is that we have to find a balance between them, because if we only focus on society needs and we're not getting our individual needs met, that's going to lead to repression and unhappiness. But then again, if we're only focusing on the id and we're just letting the id out of the cage, so to speak, then society suffers as a result. And so we need to find that happy medium. And so Freud argues that compromise is handled within the ego. I want to take a look at another Magritte image, the human condition. which gets a sense of that uncanny, things that are kind of dreamlike. What they're really questioning is, what is reality within their works, or a lot of them are questioning that, right? So as we take a look at this, the human condition, we see an easel looking out in a window, and at first we just see the window, and then we say, well, wait a minute, there's an easel there. Wait a minute, the entire image is a painting, right? So again, questioning that idea of reality, right? We read space, but we know that the painting on an easel is flat, and then we remember the whole painting itself is also flat. And so we tend to look at this and say, oh, this isn't real, this is just a painting. And then we say, well, wait a minute, this is the whole thing, right? So part of the question of surrealism is, what is real, right? A play on illusion implies that the painting is less real than the landscape, when in fact both are painted fictions. And so that's part of that uncanny, getting us to aware of what is truth, what is reality within a work of art. This one is a Salvador Dali. He's the kind of the flagship painter of surrealism, kind of the main one that comes out of this. And here we see that idea of the uncanny, things that look familiar to us. We recognize the face, the eye sockets, right, the nose, the mouth, but then it's also different to us because we have the snakes that are coming from the head. We have the skeletons inside the eye sockets with skeletons inside them and inside the mouth, and so things that look familiar and foreign to us. But again, focusing on the idea of violence, a big part of what Freud argues and Dali examines through his art is this fear of death, right? This fear of mortality, that one day we're going to die. And whether we're conscious of it or not, this fear motivates a lot of our actions, right? Our desire to make money, our desire to get good careers, our desire to be able to have a roof over our head and to have, the basic means of survival, right? This desire is pushing us, right? But then this fear of death leads to a desire to make sure that our legacy is known, right? So we have a desire to have children, to get married. We have a desire to want to make our quote-unquote mark on the world. This idea of this eternal aspirations to combat the fact that our existence is a temporary existence. And so these desires are driving the decisions that we make, whatever major we're going to make, or whatever kind of career we're going to go into, or what type of family we're looking to have, that these ideas are kind of underneath the surface of the human condition. At least that's what Freud argues, that's what Dali examines within his art. Here's what Freud takes a look at, and this is coming after World War I. And he's taking a look at what does it mean to be human. A lot of the questions that we're going to examine through this class that artists and philosophers are taking a look at is, who am I, why am I here, where am I going? Let's take a look at how Freud defines the human condition here. He says men are not gentle creatures, and I think we can expand that. I don't think it's necessarily gender specific. I don't think that's what he means, is to be gender specific. I think he means mankind. Men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowment is to be reckoned as a powerful share of aggressiveness. And that the past kind of Victorian, Jane Austen kind of view of humanity is that we're all just noble creatures. We're all trying to be good, and there's a few bad apples that are out there, sure. But at the very core, we're just kind of nice, gentle, godly people. We're created in the image of God to be like him. Freud takes another look at this, right? Influenced by Darwin's ideas that we're more animal-like, he'd suggest that underneath the surface, we're actually very violent people. That our instinctual endowment, right, at the very core of who we are, we like being aggressive. And that aggressiveness isn't necessarily physical aggression, like we're going up and hitting people all the time. It can be, humor. It can be emotional aggression. It can be verbal aggression, right? It could be passive aggression, right? But this idea that we like to, exert this violent tendency underneath the surface. And we can take a look at whether Freud was perhaps too influenced by World War I and the aggressiveness of World War I. But as we take a look at the 20th century was by far the bloodiest century of human existence, right? With political entities putting its own citizens or other countries to death, right? Become very efficient at that. And so, I don't know, maybe there's something to this. He says, as a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, to kill him. Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. Who in the face of all this experience of life and of history will have the courage to dispute this assertion? And so that's kind of a cheeky question, but I'll kind of pose that to you. Do you agree with him, or do you think this is perhaps an oversimplification? Keeping in mind, right, as we take a look at the violence and the conflict, certainly the things that have happened even just this year in 2021, all of the aggression that's happened, can we really dispute his assertion, right? And then, so my question is, does this define humanity? Is he accurate? And more importantly, does this define you? Generally, people, I'll ask them, does this define humanity? And they'll take a look and like, yeah, actually, humans are pretty, aggressive. And then I'll say, well, does this define you? And they say, well, no, obviously, I'm not aggressive. And I'm like, wait, are you not a human? And you just said all humans are like this. And so then the question is, what do we do with this, right? And again, that aggressiveness can be, sporting events. It doesn't necessarily have to be trying to stab someone, but the aggressiveness of competition could be part of it, right? The aggressiveness that we see at Wall Street or in business could be part of it, right? This idea of the films that we watch are forms of aggression, right? Take a look at all the aggression and the darker things, the sexual content that's within a lot of the films and the media today. And the question is, if we weren't wanting that, right, Hollywood would not produce it for us, right? But these become popular for a reason. And so, again, the question is he right? And what do we do with that information? Freud suggests that we need to find positive outlets for that. I wanted to show you one last image of Dali that just shows that surreal, dreamlike quality to this. A lot of people like Dali just because it looks realistic, and so it's more representational than other art that we're going to take a look at this semester. And so immediately it has that kind of, it's a bowl of fruit. It looks like a bowl of fruit, right? The Brian Regan definition. But I think the other component to Dali is it looks like something, but then it kind of doesn't, right? And so there's that tension within that. And this one you see swans reflecting elephants. And so you see the swans at the top, but then as you look in the water, you see them turn into elephants. And so as we look deeper, right, there's this new level. And I think people like that, the new layerings that Dali inserts within his works. But again, it's a question of reality. Do we really know what is real? Can we really know what is real? And is our reality that we're seeing within our rational mind the actual reality, or is it just a mental projection of our own desires or our own, understandings, our own biases and whatnot? I wanted to show you this clip of Salvador Dali, and it gives you a sense of him in a different kind of context. I'll kind of skip forward. This is called What's My Line? And what they do is they have someone come on. Generally, it's not a celebrity. It's generally just someone within, the work industry. And then people will guess, have like 20 questions to guess what their career is. And this will give you a new kind of dimension of Salvador Dali.
Here that might be in appearance, costuming, name, some area of identification which would give you too much information, so you're blindfolded. I would just ask our guest if you are fully familiar with how we keep score?
Yes.
All right, then in that case, let's let the folks at home and our friends here in the theater know exactly what your line is. Our guest, who must also be unnamed, is self-employed. With that, let's begin the general questioning with Arlene Francis.
Are you associated with any of the arts?
Yes.
Would you ever have been seen on television?
Yes.
Are you a performer?
Yes.
Would you be considered a leading man?
Yes.
I got to move in here. Actually, in the general context of the questioning, we would have to accept that all the affirmative replies, except perhaps the last one, are not misleading in any major degree. However, I think the last answer is misleading, and we could not accurately describe our guest as a leading man.
He's a misleading man.
Misleading man he is. 1 down and 9 to go, Mr. Sir.
Have you achieved eminence in some field other than television?
Yes.
Would it be the sort of exploit that might possibly reach the front page of a newspaper?
Yes.
Is it an exploit that's been on the front page of the newspapers within the past couple of weeks?
No.
No. 2 down and 8 to go, Miss Kilgallen.
Do you imagine that we're blindfolded because one or more of us would recognize you at sight?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Are you accustomed to appearing before audiences?
Yes.
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you're wearing now?
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you are wearing now? I would say that under certain specific conditions, it is not impossible that our guest would wear less than is being worn now, but it's not necessarily germane to what it is we're trying to arrive at.
Is that a yes or a no?
That is a kind of up and down yes.
Well, all right. Do you have anything to do with sports or any form of athletic endeavor?
Yes.
Ball conference. Yes, sir. Now, I think it would be too misleading to suggest that our guest had a basic affiliation with sports. This is not to say that it is not within the compass of his enjoyment to indulge in this particular endeavor.
Thank you.
3 down and 7 to go, Mr. Lawford.
I'm still working on the last one. Do you appear continuously on television? By that I mean once a week or once a month. Can I see you?
No.
No. 4 down and 6 to go, Miss Francis.
Do you use anything in your hands for your job? Like a pencil or a typewriter or anything like that?
Yes.
Would you be considered a writer?
Would you be considered a writer?
Yes.
Yes,
There's nothing this man doesn't do. What we have to guess is an all-around man.
And here's
Are
Dolly's
you
explaining to
well-known
him how many
because
books
of a
he's
book
written.
that has been published of yours?
Miss Arlene, if I may interrupt here, I would have to agree that we must consider that our guest is a writer.
We're going to agree that we must consider that
Not to
our
mention
guest
films.
is a writer. We're going to consider it. You mean we're going to consider whether he is or whether he isn't?
No, this is merely, actually, to try and be completely fair. The talents of our guest are not encompassed entirely in this area of work.
Oh, then you can do several things. Truly, except sports.
That's a fair assumption, yeah.
Have you had... I'm terribly lost. Have you had something published?
Does our guest have something published?
Yes.
Yes.
Does he write humorously?
Do you write humorously? Yes, and then I think is properly yes and no.
Oh. Could he, does he ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Do you ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Yes.
Yes?
Our guest says yes, he does drawings like comic strips.
Is there something quite unusual about our guest?
I beg your pardon, Arlene? I missed that last one.
I just asked if there is something unusual because everything that he does, the audience laughs about.
No, there's nothing unusual, actually. This sort of thing goes on all the time.
I'm going to pass to Bennett.
Mr. Cerf?
You are a human being,
Very much so, Bennett. Very much so.
and there is no animal or dummy out there with you.
That's right. There is no animal or dummy out there with him except, perhaps,
I'm not talking about the master of ceremonies.
that'll be all.
Have you ever written a book that was published by my firm?
Did Random House ever publish a book for you?
Yes.
And that will teach you to make remarks about the Master of Ceremonies, sir.
Was this book published within the past year?
No.
No, that's 5 down and 5 to go, Miss Gilgallen.
Is it possible that we have not yet struck upon the major thing that our guest is famous for?
That is very possible.
He is still maintaining that he's a performer.
Well, yes, in the degree that he was asked if he had anything to do with the arts and then was asked if he was a performer, in that large context, we would have to accept that he was indeed a performer.
Well,
You want a conference?
yes, I'd love a conference, Arlene.
Was there a call for a
maybe
conference?
have a conference, John?
You may have 15 seconds for a conference, and I'm going to give you 1 minute more to get it.
Ask if he could use his mustache to paint.
Have you a mustache that is rather well known? In fact, could you be almost caricatured just by that?
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you, Arlene. Are you Salvador Dali?
Salvador Dali is right.
I like to show these to show the humanity behind the artist. Sometimes when we take a look at their art, and some of their criticisms can push against our own views. We can tend to see them perhaps as villainous or problematic, but they're actually human beings that are struggling to find truth, right? Just seeking to use art as a means of reflecting their world around them. I want to take a look at a couple more Magritte images. Here is the false mirror, and you can take a look at this, the representation of the uncanny, right? Things that look familiar to us and foreign, right? We recognize the eye, we recognize the sky, but putting those two elements together produces more of a disorienting effect for us. But again, in titling this The False Mirror suggests that mainly what we do is we use our rational mind, we use the physical senses, the natural reasoning, as Aristotle says, the sight, sound, taste, touch, right, hearing, to make sense of the world around us. And we think that using these senses can get us closer to truth. But what surrealists are suggesting is those actually might be fooled. Our senses can be fooled pretty easily. And so if our senses can be fooled easily, then, and we're basing our information on them, then maybe the information that we have is inaccurate or unreliable. And so here's that false mirror, this false sense of reality that we're creating. Or this one, where not to be reproduced. A similar kind of idea here, where we see a person or a mannequin standing in front of a mirror, but rather than reflecting the front side, it reflects the back side, which produces this disorienting effect. Can we trust the world around us to make sense of the elements of the world, right? Can we use our senses to come to truth? And they're suggesting that it might be more complicated than that. Maybe we need to look at what's going on inside, because really we make sense of the world by what we process, right? Our mental processes, our mental constructs, and then we apply those mental constructs to our actual sight, our actual vision, and that's how we make sense of the world. So it's really not the senses per se that make sense of the world, it's our reactions to it, right? Our mental perceptions that make it. And so they're getting us to dig a little bit deeper, to suggest that if we really want to understand truth, we need to start from within. And I wanted to end off with this one by Oppenheim, My Nurse. Again, this idea of of the uncanny, right? We see the shoes, right? These kind of nursing shoes, or shoes that they used to use, that nurses used to use in the 30s, which are not very comfortable to stand on your feet all day. But then changing the context of them by making them look like a chicken, right? So what we see with Oppenheim is this is taking a look at what is reality, very similar to this, but she places this within a context of, let's take a look at how this applies to the female mind, right? The expectations of a woman to not only be a nurse, but to actually have to look a certain way, behave a certain way within this context that they're put up, much like a chicken, to look good, just to be able to be then consumed. And so getting us to take a look a little bit more deeply about our assumptions, our false assumptions, to question them so we can have a better understanding of the world around us. And this is going to be the legacy of surrealism, questioning this idea of reality, questioning the idea of our expectations of it. And this is going to cast a large shadow, much like Dadaism, over 20th century art. And these are some of the ideas that we're still struggling with today as we grapple with what is reality, what is truth, and how do we really get there. And we see this discussion really emphasized and underlined with surrealism.